Wait. Is it John and Dami?
No, Dom and Johnny.
Dom and Johnny.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, ready?
Dom
and Johnny in the morning. Okay, so today I thought it would be interesting to see what comes out of asking the question to you, what does it mean to be a white belt?
Oof.
It's a big one, I know.
I think I'm fortunate enough to have at least been 15. I know a lot of people start when they're really young.
Like me.
Yes.
I was 5, fresh 5. Yeah.
So do you remember your white belt?
So I think I remember before my first class. I remember meeting two students that ended up quitting. Not, I think maybe I got to green belt with one of them. That was the longest. But yeah, I remember meeting a little boy and a little girl my age. They did not last. They did not get to black belt with me. Which is it is weird looking back and looking at the waves and generations of being like, man, I got to second degree with this pot of people, and then I got to third degree with this smaller pot of people, and then we got the chance to test for degrees of black belt together, and this latest one, getting to test with your teacher who's also getting another rank, that was a surreal experience.
Yeah, that was pretty wild.
You also have actually become a white belt more often than I have, because I've only really trained this system. I've dabbled, in what you've shown me of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm very bad at it. But you've gone through the white belt process a few times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've gone through the white belt process with my uncle when he trained me and my brothers in American Kempo. I put on the white belt. And then recently put that on again. I met some really, really cool people that train in American Kempo, and it's been fun to share their discipline and then share a little bit of my discipline with them. So that's been really neat, and I usually strap on the white belt for that too. The Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and then the Kung Fu that I did. That was white sash, though. Does that count?
Yeah. I mean, so from my understanding, and there's legends about it, is the white belt is pretty universal, or white as the color of beginning, across a lot of different styles. So whether it's a sash or a cord, or everyone uses a different piece of cloth to tie their uniform together. But white tends to be the first color. Black tends to be the last color.
Yeah. You ever make a list of things you have to do, and then you have
often?
these really easy big things, and then you have these really tedious small things.
Okay.
And which ones do you go after first? Most people like to check off the big easy things.
Oh, I usually go the opposite. I usually start with the tedious things that I know will be easy to lose. And then I kind of build toward the big things.
Well, that's the opposite for me.
Yeah.
I love the feeling of crossing something off the list, and I feel like that's the excitement of white belt. Is you get all these big things that you're implementing, but they're fairly easy to implement.
Yeah.
With repetition, and then it's when you get really deep into a system when you start to get those really small, intricate things that take so much focus and dedication to even feel somewhat proficient at. And I think that's why, throwing on a white belt every now and then and trying something new is so exciting.
Yeah.
Because it's just whoa, look at all this cool stuff.
Yeah, well, all right. I guess from that perspective, I've already talked about in the first 2 episodes how, teaching, you have to start with big, gross motor skills before you deepen into smaller, fine motor skills. Because if you're trying to teach something with fine motor and the person doesn't have a foundation of gross motor, it's just a mess. It's just all over the place, and it ends up delaying their journey. So, I guess... Yeah, white belt being the big important things, I think, is a pretty good way to kind of sum it up. I think in our style, from a self-defense standpoint, the big checkbox I like to see before I test someone from white to yellow is, have I increased the probability a lot to cause a disruption in the attacker? So the way I look at like a white belt student, because from my understanding, this is what Fred Villari looked at too, was if you have 45 minutes to teach someone how, like, the most likely thing to save their life, it's nothing fancy, it's kick them and run away, or block kick them and run away. So I really think, from our system anyway, I know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you stay at white belt a lot longer. But for our system, that's kind of the goal.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, that, and if I had to add anything, shape of the body is probably the other big one that I think is important at white belt. If you have good shape, that will take you through your entire martial arts career, and then also having good shape of the body helps you in your job. Helps. It's one of those preventative measures too.
Yeah.
If you hold yourself with good shape, you don't seem to appear like a victim.
Yep.
I always forget that stat. It's high though, but 90-something% of all crime is premeditated. Something like that.
That sounds right. I can Google it.
Yeah. So
let's put it on incognito mode.
There we go.
How much of all crime is premeditated? Oh, okay. So this is Google AI. I don't know how good it is. So this says, studies suggest that most homicides are unplanned, but other crimes like robbery have a high rate of premeditation, which would make sense, like if you're like, because that's the other context, right? Are you trying to defend yourself against someone that's trying to take your life, or are they trying to take your stuff, and defending yourself is part of protecting your stuff? I guess would be, another dimension to add to the conversation. Yeah,
and I like my stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, I'll give it up if it's between that and
a knife or a
bullet.
gun. Yeah.
But if I have the option of keeping my stuff and not getting shot, I feel like that's the ultimate win.
Yeah. Yeah. So I also think what's interesting is in some contexts, white belt is less of a cloth or a physical skill set, and it's more of a mindset. There's the empty your cup story where you have the Zen master and he pours the tea, and the student that they're deciding to train or not is like bragging about all their accomplishments in martial arts, and so the Zen master just keeps pouring as the student keeps talking, and eventually the cup overflows and the student's like, you should have stopped filling it, and the Zen master is like, well, it's like your mind is already full. What's really interesting is there's like the counterpoint to that, which is, as a white belt, your body has no idea, it's got no habits, but once you've trained any martial art, there are going to be habits. So even in like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there might be things that, as someone who's trained another art, I might not be doing the right thing, but I'm doing something, which might actually make it even harder to learn. Mm-hmm. So in a lot of ways, a white belt is like a blank canvas where it's easier to impart good habits as long as both sides are mindful about it. Sometimes there are good habits you could build on, or sometimes there are bad habits you have to curb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have a student, and he has, for his age, he's a young teen.
Yep.
He has an incredible amount of upper body strength for a young teen.
Yeah.
Like abnormal linebacker muscle.
Right.
So he can hit a pad harder than any other kid in that school, harder than most adults.
Yep.
He can knock us backwards if we're holding kick shields. So sometimes trying to show him how to increase more power doesn't make sense to him because he says, I can already hit strong.
Yeah.
And, so I think they're definitely 100%. There's some setbacks when you have some of those natural gifts. You think that you can, whatever your strength is, you should be able to amplify it.
Right.
Not just fall back on it and use it, like a cane.
Yeah. Earlier today, I was in the room while another student was getting their martial arts lesson from Ken. And to that point, Ken was talking about Travis Hunter, who I guess was drafted by the Jaguars. And what made him like a promising pick was the fact that in college, I guess, he could both be a wide receiver and a quarterback. So he had this, because he was such a gifted athlete, he had this this adaptability to him. The problem is at the professional level, he's having trouble with the precision of routes to be a wide receiver. And I think that speaks a lot to what you were saying, is when you've got a natural gift, in some ways some things come easier to you, but it almost sets you back in other ways, because now you can't rely on the gift as you normally would to be able to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, I think it's not even a white belt thing, because I start to see it in myself, you know, even at my rank, because I've always had a natural gift of speed. So when I spar, I tend to rely on my speed.
Yeah.
Which is something I will not have forever.
Right.
I would love to hope that I stay as fast as I am now,
yeah.
you know, in my 80s. But, you know, realistically speaking, you know, I will probably slow down. So, you know, at this point in my journey, it feels like I'm a white belt, you know, trying to, you know, make sure I'm not using my speed to compensate for timing.
Right.
So, yeah, I feel like you could always find those white belt moments no matter where you are in your journey.
And that's why in our style, specifically, every degree of black under 5th has a white stripe on it, as just a reminder that to full circle it, even if you're an expert, really an expert is just a white belt for the next level. Mm-hmm. And there is the other side of it where you can have the mindfulness of being open, but the other part of white belt is you haven't really gotten the wisdom yet. So even if there are bad habits, if you're a mindful expert of one art, you can start to figure out how to curb those bad habits, I think, a little bit quicker. Like a lot of times the white belt, I think, is like almost over idolized, whereas like if you're kind of like an expert white belt, you know, or an expert at being a white belt, you can accelerate your journey faster than someone who hasn't had a lot of experience.
So I have a weird question to kind of toss at you based on this. And you were talking about, you know, how people are with emptying their cup.
Yeah.
And the kind of the humility of white belt.
Mm.
So you and I have both seen over the years, you know, someone will enroll and they've trained in another style.
Yep.
And oftentimes we've seen, I think I've seen both ways, where we've let them keep their rank.
Yeah.
And when we started them at white belt again.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, before I say what I think, what do you think is more beneficial? So let's say someone comes in, they're a brown belt in Taekwondo.
Yep.
They want to enroll here.
Yep.
Do you let them keep their brown belt, or do you bring them back to white belt?
So the times that's happened, the first question I ask the student is, have you trained Shaolin Kempo Karate? Because like we've talked about, this is a curriculum-heavy art. Taekwondo, there are certainly mechanics that you learn, not really curriculum that necessarily transfers over well. And that's something I'm usually pretty clear about. There have been times I've had someone with a Shaolin Kempo background, and really it comes to how much of the curriculum do they already know. So if they don't train in a Volari style, but they do train, say, I don't know, some other like style that's kind of similar, but like you can tell, like, you know, their 15 combination might use different strikes or something, but like the foundation is there. A lot of times I'll just see what they can do, and if it's similar enough, that's where I kind of put their rank. Mm-hmm. So like one time I think I had a student who trained like on the other side of the state from a non-Volari school. At that school, he was a brown belt. I asked him to do all his stuff, and he had about through the green belt stuff. So I said, listen, we're going to start you at green belt, because it wouldn't make sense to start you at white belt and just make you do 6 combination for a few months. But it also wouldn't make sense to try to start you at brown belt and then try to jam a lot of stuff in. A lot of times, like, there have been times here where a student, if they like got to orange belt at age 6 and they come back at age 14 and they remember nothing, I do start them at white belt again, because it's like I'm not going to start you at orange belt and then try to cram a bunch of stuff. I'm going to let you grow with the body that you now have. So most likely for the Taekwondo example, I would probably start them at white belt with the understanding that you're at white belt not mechanically, but you're at white belt in terms of just learning this curriculum progression.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I think about that a lot, because back in the 70s, 80s, and even 90s, I think it still happens today. But I think there was a very, it wasn't frowned upon, it was normal to get your first degree or Shodan in a style and then find another teacher, and then they would promote you right to your second degree. And then another teacher would promote you to your third, and, without going backwards. And, I always wonder how, and even Master Valari, Master Valari had his second degree, and then his Kung Fu teachers promoted him to third, fourth, and fifth.
Yeah.
From my understanding. And completely normal. And it made sense. But I always wonder where that line is. Does it depend on the individual and their understanding of their art and their ability to kind of mix in something new they learn? And are there times where a teacher, should look at that example and be like, you're not ready to stack something on top. We need to go back and learn those foundational principles of this style.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it also, I think that they're still figuring a lot of things out back then. It's been 40, 50 years since then, and, like, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a great example where it's at least 13 years to earn your black belt in a Gracie system. Yeah. So if I were a first degree in this system where it takes about 5 or 6 years, it doesn't make sense that I would have the same. I probably have a lot. I would need to start at white belt and then work 13 years to get to black belt. So the colors don't always match up. Yeah. So like I can see the merit to it of basically if you go to, like, say, an open training workshop of having one belt with a stripe for signifying each rank you've gotten in a different style or whatever. But I do think if you're gonna, like, dedicate yourself to a particular style for a little bit, you can be a blue belt in something and be a black belt in something else and be a brown belt in a third thing. I don't know. That's how I'd look at it.
Yeah, I was just curious. Yeah. Throw that one out there.
So we do have some listener questions.
Was I supposed to sing that with you?
I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever sing it again. So because we're speaking of different styles, right? So this question is, how do different mechanics express themselves in combinations as we go up through rank? Because Shaolin Kempo Karate is in a lot of ways a blended style, but in other ways it's a sequential style where you start with karate because you get explosive structured power that can disrupt an opponent to help you get away. It builds into Kempo around blue belt in order to learn effective patterns that can mess up a more experienced opponent. And then Shaolin is long-term health, wellness, integration, and then how your whole body works as an efficient unit in order to transfer power. So, like, different combinations, let's say, like, white through brown belt. How do the mechanics kind of progress? The other context to this is this listener, his instructor said all of the combinations are Shaolin, which I don't think is wrong. But also, there have been times you've been like, this feels more Kempo. So... Yeah.
I think I'd preface this with, and this is not a universal truth. This is just my opinion. So, just in case anyone with more stripes than me is listening.
Yeah.
But it has always seemed to me that the karate we learn is karate that's been dusted with Kempo.
Yeah.
And then the Shaolin we learn is Shaolin that's been dusted with Kempo. So Kempo's like the core. And then you have, karate Kempo, and Shaolin Kempo kind of in there. Because it makes sense. Master Valari, when he put the system together, and I think that's why a lot of times the history gets a little hazy, is because it's important to remember that even if he did take the framework from somewhere else, like the principles he built that framework upon are his own absolute insane martial artsness, you know? So learning, two kata in a Karatecast school versus learning two kata, at a Fred Villari school is a very different experience. The moves may be similar, but how he uses those mechanics, he uses the combinations and forms more like a vehicle to convey principles. And I think that's the important thing to remember, and I think that's why things from white to black in these combinations kind of have more of a smooth transition, as opposed to if you were a school that trained in like true Shotokan or Goju-ryu or something like that, and then transition to Hawaiian Kempo, where there'd be a pretty significant, leap. It would feel weird. So I guess if we took, are we talking about like a singular combination evolving white to black, or the different combinations white to black?
I think it's the different combinations. So not like, you're a white belt who learned 6 combination, which is the first one. It's not how like 6 combination changes from white to blue to black. It's more just like maybe we can talk about both. It becomes more, but I think the heart of the question is more like, how are the white through purple belt combinations, how are the mechanical lessons you're trying to teach different than like blue and blue stripe as a set, and then like green stripe, and then brown?
Gotcha. I would love to hear your take on this.
Yeah.
But I would say that especially white through orange, that beginner set, it's, don't get hit back.
Yeah.
It kind of, you're thinking 6 combination, you're standing your ground, they're coming in, you're hitting them with a front kick and crossing out. 7 combination, you're getting out of the way, don't get hit.
Yeah.
You kick, hit back. 3, you learn the footwork to get to the outside. 5, you learn the footwork to get to the inside. It's essentially evade or block and or both.
Yep.
Hit back and get out. And then I think purple belt is where you start seeing Fred Villari's concept of anytime you touch your opponent, whenever you make contact with them, you should be affecting their balance in some way. And I feel like you start to see that at purple belt with 18 and 4, and then with also being the first combinations you retreat in. So you're not only manipulating their balance, but you're also retreating. So you see, the very basic framework of get out of the way, kick or punch, cross out, stay safe. And then now it's starting to manipulate your opponent. And then I feel like as you get more to the advanced stuff, especially as you get upwards of green belt, I think it's just expanding on those principles.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm very curious to hear what you think about
before
this.
that, one thing I want to touch on is you mentioned karate with a dusting of Kempo, and then Shaolin with a dusting of Kempo.
Yeah. What
would the Shaolin look like without the Kempo dusting? Because I know I kind of have an idea what the karate would look like without the Kempo dusting.
That's a hard one. Even the karate one's kind of hard. Because I think a lot of times when we think of karate, we think of Shotokan.
Yeah.
But then, if you look at the Waterryu guys, like the way they move is karate, but it's probably one of the more strange karate styles. Just like they usually have open hands instead of the fists when they're on their guard. They move a little bit different, so there is a little bit of variety there. But the Shaolin is way harder because technically speaking, Shaolin is any martial art taught at Shaolin. So that could be a handful of things depending on the source. So the monks would learn typically 1 or 2 styles and master them. They weren't masters of all.
Right.
So, actually, the old Kung Fu TV show, great show. The martial arts, not so much. But the show and the message is really good. And David Carradine was awesome. But he was being walked through the temple, and they said, talking about tiger and crane and all the different animals, and they're looking at the guys doing the style. And he said it could take a lifetime just to master one of these styles. And I think that was kind of the Shaolin mindset. They'd learn, maybe 3 forms, and they'd work years on each one of those. So, it's hard to say what Shaolin would have looked like without knowing, kind of what Fred's teachers taught. So, and he had multiple teachers. He had his father who taught him Kung Fu. And then he had 2 individual teachers that he learned from, after his Kempo training. So it could have been 3 completely different styles.
Well, even that though, like even understanding that in the temple you would specialize in one of many different options, like that the Kempo kind of explains a little more because Kempo, from my understanding, is eclectic in the sense that you want to be versatile, so you study a lot of different things rather than specializing in just one thing. So like Shaolin Kempo in the sense that you aren't just specializing in one thing. You're paying attention to a lot of the principles and kind of combining it with your body type, strengths, and all that sort of stuff. It's broader than one thing or one or 2 things.
I think if we're talking general,
Yep.
broad scale, in most northern styles of Shaolin, you're going to see that Kempo is more efficient in its movement.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have very big movements. It's designed to be very efficient.
Yeah.
So I would say if you took our Shaolin forms and made them more pure, I think the movements would probably be bigger.
Yeah.
So, and not to offend anyone at all that trains in, more traditional Shaolin, because it's a beautiful style.
Right.
But a lot of those styles, depending on where you learn from, these are ancient styles.
Yeah.
So, and they were fighting people who were fighting similarly.
Right.
And, combat has refined so much over the years. And I think that's where hybrid styles like us, where we kind of adapted to more modern practices of fighting.
Yeah.
Because these guys weren't fighting Western boxers. They weren't fighting, wrestlers for the most part.
Yeah.
So it just was a completely different landscape. It was a different need.
Yep.
So I would think that the movements would probably be longer.
Yeah.
Not to that effect. Those guys can still practice their martial arts when they're like 90 years old. So I feel like that's one of the best benefits that we've taken from, the Chinese boxing world.
And that is something where if you take someone who's done kind of like how we can do a quote-unquote karate form from the Shaolin Kempo karate mix, and you look at someone who does like a Shotokan, you're like, that I can see where they're similar, but they do look different. There's something different going on under the hood. In the same way as like I say kung fu. You definitely say it more authentically. Is it gung? Yeah, all right.
Yeah, just the romanization. They're both correct technically.
But so you could watch someone do like I sent you a video of some cool animal forms that came across my YouTube feed, and it just. Ours look different because there's something that it's probably the Kempo dusting. There's just something else going on under the hood where it has the same outside, but that the internals are just a little different. So
absolutely, yeah.
Oh, so I was supposed to answer the question about the progression. So I think speaking of the progression of Karate, Kempo, Shaolin, that is also our forms curriculum. That is the progression. You start with karate, very structured. Then you get to Kempo, a little more practical. And then you get to Shaolin, which is really where principle is emphasized. There is definitely application, and a lot of times there are also stylized parts in order to get your body moving a certain way. Each of those forms is a vessel that you can fill with principles. So one of the things I have the privilege of doing now is watching a second degree kind of review through all of the under black belt forms in preparation for Ningali, which is a very infamously difficult form to feel good with. And one of the things that Ken is talking about are all the Shaolin principles that you can practice in 1 and 2 pinyin, which are normally karate forms. The karate principle of root, hit, that's a karate thing.
Yes.
The Shaolin thing, very briefly touch on it, moving with the spine and training your feet to support your spine rather than moving your feet and then moving your spine. Yeah. So it's just which part of your body is moving first. So just as how that might be a karate form, but it can be a vessel for karate, Kempo, Shaolin, I think that when you're looking at the combination progression, whether or not you argue that 6 combination is a Kempo combination, I think no matter what, the combinations like the forms are vessels for principles. And I do think, especially white and yellow belt, the way I think of them is in pairs rather than as triples. So the white and yellow belts are really about positioning after the fact. So like 6, your position is you stay where you are, which is really hard for a lot of people. 7 is you get out of the way. 3 is you advance to the outside of the guard. 5 is you advance to the inside of the guard. Then, oh, by the way, for Valari's people that don't, we teach 5 earlier. We don't teach it at orange, we teach it at yellow. We also teach 14 at blue stripe instead of green. I don't know when people teach stuff, that's how we do it. So then orange, you only have 2, and then purple, you've got 4 and 18. So to me, orange and purple are more about the follow through. Because if you think about 3 and 5, we also don't teach the takedown in 3 at yellow. We just start through the back punch. So it's more like you hit him a few times and then you bail. Or you hit him a few times and then you hope the fight is over. Whereas 2 and 4, even 2 is more about affecting their balance in the way that you described 4 and 18. So blue and blue stripe, I tell my students, those are your kicking ranks. You're learning about your core strength and how your core can support being able to kick. The double kicks in 8 and 9, like I make it pretty clear to my students, I have no illusion that this is something you're going to use on the street. I'm sure you could. But in the benefit to kicking twice off the same leg is you're developing core strength and awareness. That's like the most important thing because it's not very likely someone at school is going to punch at you, hopefully, but you might fall. So being able to not fall is also a win in my book. And then green and green stripe really are about moving from the big check boxes to the little ones, like you said earlier. And then brown is the efficiency, like how quickly can you end a fight and end up in a control position. So I think that especially white through purple is probably more karate style movements. Blue through green stripe is probably more Kempo-y. Brown, I think, I don't know if I'd put a style to it. It's just getting good. and then first degree and higher is where the Shaolin principles come in, and you can revisit your older combinations to see how you can practice the Shaolin principles in kind of a simpler vessel.
That's why you've got 5 stripes. That's
All right, well, I'll accept the compliment. But I think it was similar to what you said.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Who knows?
Okay. So the next question, because we only have time for one more. So this one was asked by one of our adult students, which is how do we adapt this system for different body types, ages, and levels of mobility?
Great question. That is 100% inherent in the system. So it usually it's something you see more after black belt, but it's something that especially if there's, the style has to fit you, and that's how Master Valari taught all of his students. And that's why we have a bunch of 10th and 12th degrees that all look completely different because they have different body types.
Yep.
And so they shouldn't fight the same. So, for instance, I always like, this is outside of our system, but I always like the Bill Superfoot Wallace example because he messed up one of his legs really, really, really badly. And instead of giving up on martial arts or trying to do things the way that everyone else did it. He just heavily favored his good leg, and he became a champion, a martial arts champion. Back in the day when karate tournaments were pretty bloody.
Yeah.
And it's because he became so proficient with that one leg because he had to, that he became a champion. And that's kind of how our system is supposed to be. We're all different. We all have, and not just for handicaps like a leg, not working, but just height, size, weight. I'm a smaller guy, so for me to do the art the same way that John does wouldn't make sense. I don't have the same kind of mass.
And for me to be tried as fast as you are, it doesn't work. I've tried. Yeah.
Throwing is something that I tend to do a lot because my hips are usually already underneath my opponent's hips.
Yep.
So it makes it pretty easy for me to get under them. And at the beginning ranks, the good news is a lot of the stuff is pretty universal.
Yeah.
Really what you're going to be thinking about as far as adapting goes is targeting. So from my understanding, Master Joan Rickert, and a lot of times where strikes would go straight, hers would be aimed upward because of her size. And I Master Jenny was very similar too. And it's because why would you train, to punch straight to someone's solar plexus when their solar plexus is your head height.
Yeah.
So so you adapt the art, as best you can. And then, as far as anything with the legs go, because especially as you age, if knees are weak or anything like that, little things like just, toeing out a little bit if there's some knee pain. Anything you could do to make the art comfortable, because as Master Fritz used to say, the art should be as natural as walking.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too.
I think because there are both sides of it, right? There's the what do you change to accommodate a reasonable limitation, but how do you not allow those limitations to define your art?
Ooh, yeah.
So, like, the thing that comes to mind is we talk about it with push hands and Tai Chi, which is the metaphor of drawing silk. So you got a silkworm, you're drawing silk from it. If you're too rough, it snaps. But if you're too soft, it clumps. So you have to find that kind of Goldilocks, just right tension in order to get the material you need. So I think that, obviously, let's use Bill Superfoot Wallace as an example. If he just tried to tough it out and work his injured leg, he would have hurt himself and he would have been unable to train. But if he didn't put in the right amount of energy, his body would have atrophied. He wouldn't have been a champion.
Yeah.
So that's the difficult thing, is if you do too little, you atrophy. So you have to figure out, what is your limit, and your limit is about 30% more than you think it is. So, and the other thing I just think is, if you have, especially, like, I'm thinking the mobility side of it, you have to do more outside of training to support it so that you don't atrophy everything else. So, my mom, for example, she's got limited mobilities in her ankles and shoulders. In terms of generating power, especially Shaolin type power, it really starts to become a limiting factor. So what she does is she works extra hard, like resistance bands, safe weightlifting, in order to make sure she maintains the mobility she has, rather than just trying to not do it to protect it, because then it becomes even more frozen and it becomes even more limiting. So, my sister and I were actually talking about one of our explorers, he has limited mobility on, like, the left half of his body. So, one time without even thinking about it, we put out hurdles in an obstacle course. We're like, all right, kids, you get to jump over the hurdles. And then halfway through, we see this kid kind of working his way up. And we're like, oh my goodness, I didn't even think. And what he did is he looked at it and he just leapt over that first hurdle, missed the second hurdle, completely destroyed it, but then leapt over the other one. And, when we weren't thinking in terms of how do we accommodate his limitation, his immediate thought was, how do I figure it out? And I think that especially as we get older and we get very protective of ourselves, the natural instinct is try to protect it, but the safest thing to do is to leave your comfort zone sometimes, which for other people, when their comfort zone is overworking, right, it's actually not, it's uncomfortable to slow down and kind of take it easy. So the comfort zone thing isn't one-dimensional. You can be on either side of it, but you're trying to pay attention to that the tension in the silk. I think would be how I'd approach it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. There's a Ramsey Dewey, if anyone follows him. He's wonderful. His voice is incredible. He has one of those really deep voices when he talks.
Not like me.
Yeah. No, me neither. I get called ma'am on the phone on a daily basis. So
I've been there.
But he was talking about a buddy of his that messed up. I think it was his leg, and he would call him over to pick him up out of his chair and get him on a bar so he could do pull-ups to make sure that he was working his upper body while his lower body was healing. So yeah, completely agree. There's always a way, to make sure that you're still progressing and growing without making not the excuse, but letting something difficult hold you back.
This one just came to mind, and I feel compelled to share it. Throughout the years, we've had many adults really nervous about falling. Over the age of 65 and older, it's the number one trigger of mortality, right? So if the fall doesn't get you, the stay in the hospital probably will. And so a lot of times, a lot of our adults in classes will ask not to be taken down. I think that's fine, but again, you should probably practice it on your own then. You should find a way to practice how to fall, practice, intense falling in a controlled space where you don't have to rely on somebody else. I think finding a way to just practice slapping out is probably the most important skill we learn ever.
Yeah.
Blocking a punch is nice. Not falling and hitting your head is way more likely to come up, I think, for most people. So yeah. So if you're nervous about something like that, I think figuring out something. I don't have a good answer on it, but it's got to be supplemented with outside of the dojo practice,
It's that sometimes our self-preservation mechanic, kind of steers us wrong.
Right.
But was it Master Oogway in Kung Fu Panda that said, sometimes the steps you take to, avoid catastrophe are what caused the catastrophe in the first place. So sometimes avoiding practicing falling out of fear of hurting yourself will cause you to really hurt yourself when you do fall without the practice.
Exactly, Yep. Dumb and Johnny in the morning. Man, FedEx is here now too. That's how they get you, Dom. They make you bundle a cell phone to just get better internet.